So, in spring we love our bulbs, but the time to really think about bulbs is now in autumn, because we really only got about a month left before is really the last date at which we should be planting them. And of course the autumn garden is very different to the spring garden. So when we look at places to plant bulbs, we have to think a lot about what that part of the garden is going to be looking like in spring. And for some bulbs which are going to be there and growing and getting steadily bigger every year, then they're a permanent proposition, so we need to think much more carefully about where they go. So today I really want to focus on selecting places for bulbs. Now, tulips flower spectacularly in their first year and not so well in their second, and only very rarely in their third. Tulips can, of course, just go anywhere and make a splash. But then there are smaller bulbs like snowdrops, Chionodoxa, Ephaeon, and these can be shoehorned in amongst perennials because they're not bothered by the later growth of perennials, which means you can fit them in really closely to other larger plants, which is really convenient. But then we come to a real spring favourite. Daffodils are a bit more of a problem because daffodils are very long-lived, and we'll be planting daffodils and they'll be there for many years, potentially many years to come, which means that we need to choose places where, for one thing, they will have space to grow and their clump to get steadily bigger, but we also don't want lots of messy foliage after flowering getting in the way of other plants or being at the front of a border, for example. Because daffodil foliage, we know it's really important to leave that foliage on after flowering to build up strength for next year's bulbs, but it does tend to look a bit messy. So we're going to look around the garden now and look at good places and bad places for those longer lived bulbs. So here is a nice big space. So unless you're thinking of putting in a great big bunch of bulbs, this is just the kind of place I wouldn't put bulbs, daffodils at any rate, because a much better use of this space might be for a small shrub or a larger perennial. So spaces like this perhaps keep for something else. So here we've got a space between a lavender in about 3 years and some salvias here, and this is, I think, quite a good place for perhaps medium to larger daffodils. The lavender is going to grow, the salvias are going to grow, but there's enough space there for some daffodils. So here we've got a space under a shrub. We've got Guelder Rose, Viburnum opulus, and this is the sort of place that is actually a good place for bulbs, because in the spring this won't have any foliage, and it's just the kind of location where a lot of bulbs would naturally grow. If this area is a bit hidden in the summer by the foliage, it doesn't really matter because the bulbs won't be there. Although what we might consider doing is just taking out some of these lower branches if we do want to make whatever we plant here a bit more visible. So here we've got an evergreen shrub, an Echium, and to be honest, I'm surprised by just how quickly it's grown. And 2 years ago I did plant some Dutch iris underneath, which are now going to be terribly overshadowed, which means I'm probably going to have to dig them up. So evergreen shrubs are not a good place for planting bulbs because they don't give the bulbs that window of light, window of opportunity in spring. So underneath will be permanent shadow, so not really a very good place. So here is the grass Stipa tenuissima, which is very popular now. A lot of us grow it, and a lot of us, after a couple of years, realise that it's very thick. It's very thin. It doesn't spread, and in fact is quite short-lived. So in other words, it's quite gappy, which means it's a great location for mixing and matching smaller bulbs. And I do stress bulbs that are no larger than it, because you don't want dead daffodil foliage flopping over the grass. But there's a lot of opportunity both between the clumps and even in amongst them, and I can imagine some really nice spring effects here. So here we've got a nice looking space for some bulbs next to a Begonia. Begonia, of course, having these bright pink flowers in the spring. But Begonia will grow probably 15, even 20 centimetres a year. And of course, it's evergreen and nothing will grow underneath a Begonia. So in other words, this is not a good place to plant long-lived bulbs because the Begonia will just swamp them. So here we've got a daffodil bulb, but when we open a bag of daffodils we very often find some that are like this. They've got little side bulbs, or sometimes a double. For some reason we call these daughter bulbs, never son bulbs, I don't know why, but this shows that daffodils will increase, and every year you'll end up with one original daffodil becoming a steadily bigger clump. That's one of the really good things about them. So when it comes to planting bulbs, people often worry about planting depth. 2 to 3 times the height of the bulb is usually enough. Over time, bulbs will find their own depth, and indeed we often find they will dig themselves surprisingly deep. Talk to anybody who's been involved in daffodil heritage conservation work, and they will certainly tell you how deep some of those old bulb clumps can dig themselves. So we need to basically dig a sufficient hole for them to fit in a reasonable number. Spacing is not crucial. Daffodils, more space between them perhaps than many other bulbs because they will spread, but it was good, sort of at least 5 centimetres or so between each is usually plenty. Fortunately, we've got nice light soil we can dig away, and not encountering too many stones, I don't think. I personally like to plant in quite small clumps, and people generally favour odd numbers. For some reason, we seem to feel that looks better. So this is my usual habit of sort of planting them out in a planting 5 in a clump. Having lots of small clumps does look better, really, perhaps than having one big clump. Somehow makes them look more natural, as if they're growing there by themselves. So just sort of covering over with the soil now, getting it back to the same level, levelling off, and then putting in a short stick so that I can remember not to plant anything else there over the next winter. So I've got about 20 centimetres on each side there for the bulbs, and I'll know where they are. So that's it. I hope I've been able to introduce you to some ideas about finding good places for longer lived bulbs, particularly daffodils, which can have such a long and such a satisfying lifespan. Now, of course, I've indicated where I've planted my bulbs with the little stick, so that I know not to plant anything immediately around them. But of course that little stick is almost certainly not going to be there next year. So we inevitably forget where we plant our bulbs, and inevitably when we go to plant a new shrub or perennial, we sometimes find ourselves digging bulbs up. But what I found, there is a really easy way of helping you avoid that, which is when they flower in spring, go around with a camera, with your phone, and just photograph where the plants are. It really helps if you have a very distinct landmark in the picture, something in the garden that you will immediately recognise, and you can locate those flowering bulbs vis-a-vis that landmark. And so with that digital record you can check up where your bulbs are and avoid planting things on top of them, or of course planting more bulbs on top of them next autumn. On the subject of daffodil labelling, I'm going to end with a rather terrible little story about plant conservation. there are thousands of daffodil varieties, and it's always been really difficult keeping tabs on them, because once they're planted, labels get lost very quickly, and unless you've located exactly where they are, the name and the plant go missing. And there's a famous collection of daffodils in Scotland at Brodie Castle, because in the early 20th century, Major Brodie was one of the real pioneer early daffodil breeders. And the National Trust for Scotland went to great lengths to source Brodie daffodils from all over the world to bring them back to Brodie Castle to build up a collection to show off the heritage of what Major Brodie had achieved. So all the daffodils were planted out, and they all got a nice sturdy metal label saying what they were. Anyway, on the estate, the Brodie Castle estate, there was a holiday cottage, and one summer a family stayed there with some children who had great fun pulling up all the labels. And since there was no plan, the links between daffodils and names was lost, and the whole identification process had to start again. But that won't happen these days with our easy digital photography. Much easier to keep tabs on where we put our precious bulbs.